Okay, welcome back. This is part 3 of the bolt, and then we'll do the other video, which is going to be the C sharp. So let's see where we ended off in the previous video. Okay, so we had the button that allows us to instantiate the bed. It's green when it's not overlapping anything. When it hits a wall, it goes red. So whenever we're able to place the object, we're just going to left click to drop it, and we're good to go. And remember, we also can right click to rotate. And because it's overlapping, I won't be able to drop it, so I can just spam the button and nothing is going to happen. So the next step is to allow us to delete the object at any point while we've selected the button, and deactivate the button. So here's a big problem with it as it is. We can spam this button, so I can click bed, and we're just going to spam more and more and instantiate more of these beds. We don't want to do that. We want this button to become deactivated when we're actually using that button. Actually, we want to deactivate all buttons. So let's start off by going to the Tiny Room Manager. I'm just going to open up my variables tab, just dock off my variables down here. And in the scene, I'm just going to add a new variable called button list. And we're going to make this a list. So you won't see the list here, and it's going to take a while to find it. So just type the word list, less than, button, greater than, and that'll be the variable type. So you'll see it's a variable that has a little plus. So as I add it, you'll see that it adds items to a list. So we know that this is working. We're going to update this list dynamically, so don't worry about the list as it is. And I'm going to go to my button, and I'm just going to tag my button. So I'm going to create a new tag, go to the top here in the inspector, go add tag, add a new tag. Let's just call this object buttons. I'm going to copy the name so I don't have to remember the spelling for that, and then I'm going to just assign that tag to the button. So every button I duplicate after this will have the correct tag. Okay, so let's go to our flow graph with my manager selected at the beginning of the game. So we're going to add a new event called start. So on the start of the game, for this first frame of the game, we are going to search for, and we're going to go game object dot find, and we're looking for the plural. So we're looking for game object dot find game objects with tags. So objects, not object, objects. So we're going to find all the objects with the tag that I just copied, which is called object buttons. And you'll see that on the right side, you've got this tiny little list view over here with a 1 and a 2, if you can actually zoom in to see it. And we're going to add this to the list. So I'm going to go to my scene variables on the left here, hold down Alt and drag in my variable, plug that in after the object.find, and just assign the objects we found to the list. Hold down Control and add a group around that, and we're going to just say find objects with button tag at start of game. So we're just keeping it very descriptive so we know what's happening. I'm going to put this down here. So at the beginning of the game, we're going to get the list, and while we're inside of this here, we might as well just do when we drop the object. After this, we're going to do a for each. So when we left click to drop the object, we're going to do a for each loop. Put it over here. We're going to grab the button list, because remember, we need to go through the list. So find every object in the list, and for each of the items in the list, we're going to do something through this loop, and it needs to be plugged to the body. So once everything in the body is done, then the exit will fire. So what do we want to do? We want to drag from the item here and type in button.interactable this, and we're going to say set. This allows us to make the button, whether we can click on the button or not. That's all that interactable does. If you're wondering where I'm finding this, if you go to your button, and under the button script in the inspect on the right, you'll see there's a little interactable. So let me go to my game view and see what happens. If I turn that off, notice how the button gets grayed out. The color is coming from this disabled color. So if I were to change this color to red, the button will now be this color when it's disabled, and when it's not disabled, it'll go back to its original white color. So let's leave it red for now, just to show you that it's working. So we're going through the list. If I was on the right, we're saying for each object in the list, At this point, we want to reactivate the buttons because now we're dropping it down, so we want to reactivate so that they are interactable. So we're going to add a little group around this, and we're going to say enable buttons when object is placed in the scene. There we go. That's what that does. So when the objects are placed in the scene, we're going to reactivate these buttons. So I'm just going to copy this, just these three nodes, go Control C. I'm going to go to my button script, which is here. So after we spawn the object, right at the end, I just want to paste this for loop. Turn off dictionary, you don't want that. And this time we're going to deactivate the button. So whenever we click one of these buttons to create an object, we want to turn off all the buttons in the list. Hold down Control, and we're going to say disable buttons when creating object on click. There we go. Okay, so we can test this to see if it's working, and once we do this, we're going to have a couple more issues, but let's test if this works. So I'm going to go to my list view at the bottom here. Notice how there's one button in my list because there's only one button. So if I click there, the button is grayed out, so I can't spam this button. So when I drop the object, the button is no longer blocked out, so I can select it and add a new one. So we know the functionality is working. So we can no longer just spam any of the UI buttons while we're actually creating an object. Okay, so phase 2 is how to delete this object as we created it. So we're going to go back to our room manager. This is where we're doing all this stuff here. So I'm just going to copy this on mouse input, paste it down here, and I'm going to just say when I change it from left click to middle mouse button. So when I click the middle mouse button, I want to be able to delete an object. But first I need to see if there's an object to delete or if I'm placing an object. So I'm going to go to my scene variables, grab the placing variable, and if this is true, then I've actually clicked on a button or I'm actually placing an object. If that's the case, I'm going to grab the current spawned prefab variable, and I'm going to type in game object.destroy. I'm going to select the second one. I don't need to have time. I don't need to wait a certain amount of time before I destroy the object. I want to instantaneously destroy the object. Okay, so all that's left here is to make sure that we set placing to be false again. So I'm going to drag, hold down Alt and drag placing variable in. I'm going to drag from the left side of the variable and do a bool literal and just say placing is now officially false because we're no longer placing the object. So I'm going to add a little group around this and say destroy current selected, oops, my spelling, object when middle mouse, cheap as I can't spell today, button is clicked. So that's all we're doing here. So when we click the middle mouse button and placing is true, but what that means is I want to reactivate the buttons. So I'm just going to drag this back up here and connect that to enable the buttons. So let's see what that looks like. See, I got the button. As long as the object is selectable and it's moving around with my cursor, if I click the middle mouse button, I remove the object, and I reset the variable. This is good. This is what we want. So just as a backup safety, I want to be able to say when we delete this object, we want to do this before we actually enable the buttons, and we need to do it both for when we click the button and when we delete it, is we want to grab the current spawned prefab, holding down Alt and drag it in. Let's plug both of these into that, and then we can continue this back into where it was, which is here. We want to clear this variable out. We want to make it null. So we're going to drag out and type it null so that we can clear it out. Because later on we're going to do some, we're going to be able to select multiple objects that are currently in the scene. And if we don't clear this out, we could have a weird case where as we click the next object, the original object that we selected before that tries to follow along. So we're just clearing out this variable. We're clearing this one out just so that it's empty, so we don't get any weird results. Okay, so let's just test this a few more times to make sure it's working. So I'm going to select the object, rotate it, place it into the world. I'm going to select the next one, hold down middle mouse button, I can delete it. There we go. Now what I want to do next, after we've done all of this, is I want to be able to right click on an object that's in the world so that I can select it again, and then I can delete it, move it, rotate it, do all of that stuff. So you don't want to go and, once an object is placed in the world, you're kind of set with this. It's not going to move, it's not going to change. So we want to be able to select the object and change that object, delete that object, move that object, whatever it is. So I'm just going to do it somewhere near the rotate and move spawned object, just somewhere over here. I'm again going to just copy this on mouse button, duplicate it, and move it up here. We'll just put it here for now. And on right mouse button, so when I click the right mouse button, I need to check a few things. I need to do a branch, and again, we're going to check to see if placing is true. No point trying to select an object that is already currently being placed in the world. So if placing is false, which is what we want, we're going to duplicate this, plug this into the false. So we only care about if placing is false. Okay, so I'm going to now grab all of this code that we wrote for the raycast, the camera.main, input mouse position, screen point to ray, the layer mask, and the raycast. We're going to duplicate that and move this across because we're going to use this raycast. And if this raycast comes back as true, then we're going to be able to select the object and move the object. Okay, so now the problem is we don't want to raycast for the floor because then we're potentially going to be able to pick up the floor and move it. We want to specify another layer that we want to raycast to. And we're going to create a layer for our prefab, these objects that we have. We're going to go and select one of these objects and go to where it says default layer in the inspector on the right here. Go and add a new layer. Let's call this one objects. Let's just call it objects. You could call it assets, models, whatever. I'm just calling it objects. And I'm going to assign both of these. I'm not quite sure which prefab I'm using, so I'm going to select both of them. Go to the inspector, go to the top right, select default layer and choose objects. Say just node only this object, not the children, because the other objects, the children don't have any colliders, so no point changing those layers, because the layers work with physics and raycast, so it requires you to have a collider on the object for the raycast to work. And if we open up one of these, notice how we have the box collider on the parent, but everything else doesn't have any colliders, so it would be pointless to assign the layer to the rest of the objects. Okay, now that we're done with that, we created a layer. We're going to click on this current floor layer, and here's the problem. If I just go down and say objects, notice how it says mixed, because it's now going to raycast for the floor and the object. So you want to click on floor to just make sure that we're raycasting for the object we're looking for. Okay, so again, to backtrack, when I right click, I'm going to look to see if placing is true. If it's true, we're going to do nothing because we're currently already placing an object. But if it's not, we're going to raycast, find the object, and we're going to grab the current selected, the current spawned prefab, hold down Alt and drag that in, plug that into the true, because now we need to assign the object we found here to this variable. So we're going to drag out, type in hit.collider, get. And from here, remember, collider is a component that is attached to a game object, so we need to find the game object that is attached to this. Here's the funny thing about Bolt, so type in game object dot game object. You have to type it twice so that it knows that we're getting the game object, and we're going to plug that into. So now that we have this, we have the object that we collided with the raycast. We've assigned it to this so that now it knows which object to rotate, which object to delete, and which object to move. All that is left now is to tell placing to be true again, because now we're actually placing an object. So we're going to left click and drag this in here. We're going to drag off the left and add a bool literal and set that to be true. Okay, so all that's left really, if you want to, is we want to go and copy these three nodes here, where we enable and disable the UI. We could have created a little function and just called this. For ease of use, I'm just copying and pasting the code where I need it. But the idea would be to make a custom function that you just call from all the locations and keep this in one place. So when we find an object that we can pick up, we're going to disable the UI so we can't spam the buttons again. Okay, that's it for the right click to select the object. So let's test if this works. We're going to, this one's going to be right click mouse to select placed object in the scene. There we go. That should do it. So I'll probably just change up some of these colors. They're all starting to look very black, so let's just make this one kind of this limey greeny color. There we go. So let's test if this works. So what we're going to do now, for testing, is I am going to grab the bed. Hold on. This might be a little bit of an issue with. Okay, yeah. So sometimes if you have the flow graph open, Unity has a little bit of a glitch out session. Yeah, because I think it's trying to render the flow graph and render Unity's play mode, and then you get some undesirable results. So if you start to get some weird slowdown or weird results and you just tested and it worked fine, just make sure you click on another window like the console or the project view. Okay, so I'm going to drop the object. I'm going to right click. I've now picked up the object again. I can rotate it. And I can place it. But here's the problem. I can now place the object the second time around into a wall. So now we can pick up objects, drop objects. But notice that the collider, the green mesh and the red mesh they were created no longer work the second time around. So notice how it's going. It's great the first time. Drop it, pick it up. It no longer works. So we need to rectify a few of these issues. So we're going to do that on this end here. So we're going to start by creating a custom event really quickly that we're going to call on the manager's side. So when we fire this off, we are going to call a function that is going to re-enable that collider. So the moment this fires through, we're going to go to the end over here, off the exit, type in trigger custom event. We haven't created this event, we will be creating it, so just be aware that I'm creating. And this one's going to be pick up object. You can call this anything you want. I'm going to copy the name so I have it. Now the problem is this function isn't going to be inside of this the manager. It's going to be inside of each of the prefabs. So we need to call the appropriate object and pick that object up. So we already have reference to that. It's this current spawned prefab variable. So drag that in. I'm going to plug that into where it says self. So the function I'm going to create is going to live inside of the prefab and not inside of the manager. The manager is just telling that object what to do inside of this pickup custom event. So let's go create that custom event. So I'm going to go back to my prefab, open this up, and we already have a custom event here, so we're going to add a new one. So we're going to go custom event. I'm going to paste the name that I got from the previous one that I created. And all I'm going to do is, because we essentially want to do the exact same thing as this event, we're going to duplicate this and bring it down here. And again, you could create a function that will just flip-flop between the two of them. So if it's false, it will become true. But just for ease of use, I am creating the duplicate code so it's easy to follow. So this is going to be select dropped object. So you're going to have to look at the top here. So when I pick up the object again, I want to make sure that the not overlaid mesh is on. The original mesh gets disabled and the object is no longer dropped. It's now live again, so we can move it around. So let's see how that logic works. This also will allow for the overlap events to work and the trigger events to work. So you'll see I can drop the object. When I pick it up, it's again green. I can't drop it into walls. When I find it, I drop it with left mouse button, right mouse button to pick it up again. To rotate, hold down the right mouse button. All we use the left mouse button for is to click on buttons and to just drop the object. There we go. Right mouse button picks it up. Right mouse button while holding down and moving the mouse side to side allows you to rotate the object. And while the object is selected, I just click the middle mouse button to remove it. So we can remove it when we select it from the button. We can also remove it after we place it. And that's it. So there we go. That is the next stage. So now we are able to instantiate a object based on what the button has stored in the value. So if you look at the variable here, we have a variable called prefab to spawn. So that's going to be the double bed. So if I wanted to go and just duplicate this button and add a new one, I could do so. And we have another script which manages all the ray casting, manages the object's rotation, object's position, dropping the object, destroying the object, and enabling and disabling the UI. And then obviously right click to pick up the object. So the manager is there to manage all of these details. And then the last script is on the actual prefab, which has, like we did in the previous video, when the object is overlapping something, we shouldn't be able to drop it. So we're enabling the red mesh, disabling the green mesh, and setting the overlap to be true. And when we leave that, we disable the overlapped mesh, enable the not overlapped mesh, and set the overlapping to false. And down here, this is a function that just when we drop the object, we turn on the original mesh, turn off the original green mesh, and tell the object that it has been dropped. That way, none of this variable is just being used inside of this function, so that when you overlap objects, both of them aren't turning red and green. So this object should only change red and green if it's active, which is this dropped object variable. And in the second one, we just duplicated the previous code, renamed the function to set pickup object, and then this way we turn on the green object again, disable the original object, and disable dropped so that it's now live and active again. So that's it for this video. I hope this has been helpful. In the next one, we're going to talk a little bit about UI. We're going to talk about custom functions so that we could have a light that we drop in the scene and we could turn the light on and off, have a little TV that we can turn the TV on and off, play sounds, that kind of thing. So we're just going to, now that we have the core functionality of this game, as it stands, we can put objects in, we can remove objects, we can set up different buttons with different prefabs and have a bed, have a side unit, all that. You can do lots of stuff. So from this point on, it's pretty much just expanding on the core logic and the core code. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.